Welcome back, Digital Explorers. I am Hari, and it is wonderful to have you with us again.
And I am Kimmy. Today we're navigating a fascinating and at times surprisingly intense corner of internet culture. We're unpacking the incredibly complex shipping ethics controversy in fanfiction.
Now, for anyone who might be unfamiliar with the terminology, shipping has absolutely nothing to do with maritime logistics or mailing packages. It's short for relationshipping, the fan practice of supporting a hypothetical romantic or sexual relationship between fictional characters.
And while the modern discourse around it can get extremely heated, the term itself has a pretty fun, lighthearted origin. It emerged in the mid-1990s within the X-Files fandom. Fans who desperately wanted the main protagonists, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, to get together simply called themselves shippers.
Right. They believed romance was the inevitable resolution to all that famous unresolved sexual tension on the show. And, hilariously, the fans who opposed them and preferred the characters as strictly platonic friends were called no-romancers. To explore these romantic dynamics, fans naturally turned to fanfiction.
It is fascinating because while the specific word started in the 90s, the concept is far older. /fanfiction, which focuses on same-sex pairings, dates back to the early 1970s Star Trek fandom with Kirk and Spock. You can even trace the concept of romantic fanfiction back to 1914 with a published novel called Old Friends and New Fancies, which was literally an imaginary sequel pairing up different Jane Austen characters.
I absolutely love the fact that Jane Austen fans were the original shippers. But as the internet grew, so did the friction. And this brings us to the core of today's episode, the intense ethical debate that kicked off in the mid-2010s over taboo and abusive content in fanworks.
Exactly. As fans moved onto platforms like Usenet and eventually huge sites like fanfiction.net or DeviantArt, the sheer volume of content exploded. But so did the moderation. In the 2000s, there were frequent bouts of censorship, which fans called purges. Works that depicted graphic violence, explicit sexuality, and taboo subjects like abuse, incest, and pedophilia were routinely deleted to keep the sites profitable for advertisers.
The real watershed moment happened in 2007 on LiveJournal, which was the premier blogging site for fan communities at the time. An American group called Warriors for Innocence launched a massive pressure campaign to remove extreme sexual writings. LiveJournal caved and deleted hundreds of accounts, causing widespread outrage in the fandom space. And the turbulence did not stop there. While a Russian corporation named SUP acquired LiveJournal later that same year, their mass deletions of LGBTQ+ content to comply with Russian media laws did not actually occur until a decade later, in 2017. Still, following the initial 2007 purges, the community realized they needed a space they fully controlled.
That digital destruction led directly to the creation of the Organization for Transformative Works and its flagship platform, Archive of Our Own, better known as AO3. AO3 was built as a nonprofit, ad-free haven where fans could share even the most taboo works without fear of corporate censorship.
To keep the peace, AO3 implemented an extensive tagging system. The idea was elegantly simple. Tag your content, whether it is wholesome romance or dark, triggering themes, and let the readers filter out what they do not want to see. However, as we all know, human nature and internet dynamics are rarely that simple.
Which brings us to the rise of social media platforms like Tumblr in the 2010s. Unlike LiveJournal's isolated, theme-based communities, Tumblr centralized everything. Rival factions were suddenly bumping into each other in the same communal tags, creating highly combative contact zones.
This environment is where the modern divide crystallized between two distinct warring camps, the anti-shippers, or simply antis, and the pro-shippers. Things get incredibly serious here because the fundamental disagreement revolves around whether fictional depictions of taboo subjects actively affect real-world behavior and morality.
Right. Anti-shippers firmly believe that fictional works depicting harmful dynamics, like pedophilia, incest, or extreme power imbalances, normalize those horrible behaviors in reality. They argue these works pose a genuine risk to children and act as an affront to survivors of sexual abuse.
For antis, creating or consuming this content is not just a harmless hobby. They view the inclusion of such themes as a reflection of the author's real-world desires. They often equate fanfiction involving underage characters in sexual situations with child pornography, pointing out that in the U.S., federal obscenity laws restrict fictional depictions of minors.
To establish boundaries, many users employ DNI, or Do Not Interact, notices on their personal pages, frequently grouping pro-shippers alongside universally disliked groups like racists or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. On the other side of the aisle, you have the pro-shippers, sometimes called anti-antis.
Pro-shippers forcefully reject the idea that fiction dictates reality. They argue that exploring dark or disturbing themes in fiction does not mean you endorse them in real life. In fact, they point out that many survivors of trauma actually use dark fiction to process their experiences in a safe, controlled environment.
They view the anti-shipper movement as a moral panic, comparing it to historical censorship campaigns like the Hays Code in Hollywood or the Comics Code Authority. They believe heavily in artistic free expression and see the policing of fiction as an infringement on personal liberties.
What is incredibly fascinating, and perhaps a bit tragic, about this bitter divide is how remarkably similar both camps are demographically. Surveys show the AO3 community is overwhelmingly LGBTQ+, with a high percentage of non-binary users. Both pro-shippers and anti-shippers are largely queer, neurodivergent, and report similar rates of abuse survivorship.
They also both heavily align with progressive left-wing political movements, yet they attack each other using the very language of social justice. Scholars suggest that because anti-shippers tend to be younger, often Gen Z, the movement might reflect a broader generational discomfort with unmoderated sexual material.
Unfortunately, the conflict has spilled out of theoretical debates into real-world harm. We have seen intense harassment campaigns from both sides. During the run of the animated show Voltron, Legendary Defender, fans went to war over the pairing of Keith and Shiro. Opponents labeled the ship pedophilic due to their age gap, even though both characters were technically adults in the source material.
It has even had international legal consequences. In 2019, a massive dispute erupted within the Chinese fandom of the TV series The Untamed over a real-person fanfiction pairing the main actors. This conflict directly contributed to the Chinese government completely banning AO3 in February 2020.
The tactical extremes used in these ship wars can be deeply disturbing. There are documented cases of anti-shippers spamming gore and actual pedophilic imagery to pro-shippers and AO3 volunteers just to drive them off the platform. Academics researching the fandom, like scholar Renee Ann Druin, have even faced doxing and death threats.
But pro-shippers are certainly not immune to criticism either. Media theorists have pointed out that pro-shippers sometimes use the label of anti to dismiss any and all valid critiques of their work, minimizing voices that deserve to be heard.
That is a crucial point. For example, if a fan raises legitimate anti-racist critique about how a character of color is being portrayed in a fanfic, some white pro-shippers will just dismiss them as an anti trying to police their art. It creates this unhelpful conversation-ending binary where nuance goes out the window.
Media scholar Mel Stanfield described the pro-shipper stance as a form of civil libertarianism. They sometimes conflate any form of community regulation or criticism with outright government censorship, resorting to absolutist positions where even asking for sensitivity is seen as an attack on freedom.
It really highlights the profound complexities of modern digital communities. How do we successfully balance the absolute freedom of artistic expression with the desire to maintain safe, ethical spaces, especially when those spaces are populated by vulnerable youth and marginalized groups?
That is the ultimate million-dollar question, Kimmy. It is a debate about the boundaries of fiction, the psychological weight of our fantasies, and fundamentally, how we treat each other through the screens that connect us.
Thank you all so much for joining us on this incredibly complex journey today. We hope it gave you some valuable food for thought regarding how internet communities navigate morality.
Take care of yourselves, stay thoughtful out there, and we will catch you in the next episode for another deep dive.
This episode is based on the Wikipedia article Shipping Ethics Controversy in Fanfiction, which is available under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. This podcast was crafted using artificial intelligence.